On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump walked back into the White House. Within hours, trade advisors in New Delhi stopped sleeping properly. Not because of what he said, because of what he'd already done once before. Between 2018 and 2020, Trump launched a trade war that was supposed to punish China. India wasn't the target. India was barely mentioned in most headlines. And yet, by the time the dust settled, Indian steel mills were bleeding, pharmaceutical exports had hit invisible walls, and the rupee was doing things it wasn't supposed to do. The strangest part? Some Indian industries made a fortune. This is the story of how tariffs designed for Beijing quietly rewired trade routes, turned allies into competitors, and left India holding a hand it still doesn't know how to play. Let's be clear about something. Trump's tariffs weren't some abstract policy experiment. They were blunt instruments. Steel, aluminum, solar panels, washing machines. He slapped taxes on imports from dozens of countries, but the real target was always China. The logic was simple. Make Chinese goods expensive. Force American companies to buy American. Rebuild manufacturing. Make America great again. It didn't quite work out that way. What actually happened was messier, stranger, and way more global than anyone expected. Because when you choke off the world's largest exporter, the shockwaves don't stop at one border, they ricochet. India felt those shockwaves hard. And now, with Trump back in office and already signaling a return to his tariff playbook, India's economic planners are running the same calculations they ran 5 years ago, except this time, the math is uglier. Here's the thing most people misunderstand about tariffs. They sound like border taxes. They're not. They're weapons disguised as taxes. When the U.S. puts a 25% tariff on imported steel, it's not China paying that cost. It's American companies buying Chinese steel. The tariff makes Chinese steel more expensive, so in theory, those companies switch to American suppliers. But here's where it gets interesting. What if American steel producers can't meet demand? Or what if their steel is lower quality? Or what if they just raise their prices because suddenly they can? That's when countries like India enter the picture. India is the world's second largest steel producer. When Trump's tariffs hit Chinese steel in 2018, Indian exporters saw an opening, a big one. They ramped up production, undercut Chinese prices, and started shipping steel to the U.S. in record volumes. For about 6 months, it looked like a win. Then Trump turned around and put tariffs on Indian steel too. 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, effective immediately. India wasn't the problem, but it became collateral damage in someone else's war. Let's talk numbers. In 2017, India exported about 2.5 million tons of steel to the United States. By early 2018, that number was climbing fast. Indian mills were running overtime. Port traffic in Gujarat and Maharashtra was surging. Then the tariffs hit. By 2019, Indian steel exports to the U.S. had dropped by nearly 40%. Not because American companies didn't want Indian steel, because the tariffs made it economically unviable. But here's where the story gets weird. India's overall steel exports didn't collapse, they shifted. Indian steel that used to go to America started going to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe. Trade routes rewired themselves in real time. The problem was margins. Selling to the U.S. was profitable, even with shipping costs. Selling to Vietnam or Indonesia, not as much. Indian steel producers made less per ton, employed fewer workers, and watched their stock prices sag. Meanwhile, Chinese steel producers, facing their own tariffs, started doing the exact same thing, dumping excess steel into the same markets India was now targeting. India wasn't competing with America anymore. It was competing with China in markets that didn't want a steel glut. And then there was aluminum and pharmaceuticals and shrimp, of all things. Most people don't realize this, but India is the world's pharmacy. About 40% of generic drugs sold in the US come from India. Everything from antibiotics to diabetes medication. Trump's tariffs didn't directly hit pharmaceuticals, but they hit the supply chain. Indian pharma companies rely on something called active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, the raw chemical compounds that become pills. For years, India imported most of its APIs from China because they were cheap and reliable. When Trump's trade war made Chinese imports more expensive and unreliable, Indian pharma companies faced a choice: find new suppliers or make APIs domestically. Neither option was fast. Some companies tried shifting to European suppliers, more expensive. Some tried to build API plants in India. That takes years. And in the meantime, production timelines stretched, costs rose, and Indian pharma exports to the US grew slower than projected. The irony: Trump's tariffs were supposed to make America less dependent on China. Instead, they made India more vulnerable to Chinese supply chains. Now, here's the twist. Not everyone in India lost. While steel and pharma struggled, India's tech sector quietly had a banner year. So did textiles and agricultural exports. Why? Because American companies looking to diversify away from China needed alternatives fast. India, with its English-speaking workforce, democratic government, and existing trade relationships, was an obvious choice. Apple didn't move iPhone assembly to India because of love for New Delhi. It moved because tariffs made Chinese manufacturing risky. Google, Amazon, and Microsoft all expanded Indian operations during the same period. Foreign direct investment into India jumped from $44 billion in 2017 over $64 billion by 2020. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of that investment went to services and software, not manufacturing, not the kind of jobs that employ millions of people in Tier 2 cities. India got richer on paper, but the benefits were concentrated in Bangalore and Hyderabad, not in the steel towns of Odisha or the textile hubs of Tamil Nadu. There's another layer to this that nobody talks about: the rupee. When trade wars disrupt global supply chains, currencies get weird. Between 2018 and 2020, the rupee weakened against the dollar by nearly 8%. That might not sound like much, but for a country that imports 80% of its crude oil, it's a disaster. Weaker rupee means more expensive oil. More expensive oil means higher transportation costs. Higher transportation costs means inflation. And inflation means the Reserve Bank of India has to raise interest rates, which slows down economic growth. All because of tariffs that were supposed to punish China. India's GDP growth slowed from 7.2% in 2018 to 4.2% by 2019, not entirely because of Trump's tariffs, but they didn't help. And now, with Trump back in office and threatening even broader tariffs, the rupee is already showing stress. It hit record lows against the dollar in late 2024. The cycle is starting again. Here's what makes this whole situation fascinating. India and the US are supposed to be strategic partners, allies. The US wants India as a counterweight to China in Asia. India wants American technology and investment. And yet, trade policy keeps getting in the way. Trump's first-term tariffs hurt India, but so did Biden's policies. The Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022 included subsidies and tax breaks that effectively shut Indian companies out of American green energy markets. India filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization. It went nowhere. Now Trump is back, and the signals are mixed. He's talking about universal tariffs on all imports, 10%, maybe 20% on everything. If that happens, India's exports to the US, worth over $80 billion annually, are at risk. But Trump is also talking about deepening ties with India to counter China, which would suggest fewer tariffs, not more. Nobody knows which Trump shows up, not even his advisors. Let's step back. This isn't really a story about tariffs. It's a story about what happens when the world's largest economy decides global trade rules don't apply to itself anymore. India isn't special here. Every country that trades with the US is dealing with the same whiplash. But India is a uniquely awkward position. It's too big to ignore, too important strategically to alienate, but not powerful enough to retaliate without consequences. When Trump put tariffs on Indian steel, India considered counter-tariffs on American almonds and apples. Know what happened? Indian consumers complained that almonds got too expensive, and the government quietly backed down. That's the reality. India needs the US more than the US needs India, at least in trade terms. And that imbalance shapes everything: how India negotiates, how it plans industrial policy, how it manages its currency. Trump's tariffs didn't just hit India's exports, they exposed the limits of India's leverage. So here's where we are. Trump is back, tariffs are back on the table, and India is running the same playbook it ran last time, hoping for a different result. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has said India's prepared for all scenarios. Reserve Bank Governor Shaktikanta Das has said the rupee is stable. Trade officials have said India is ready to negotiate. Maybe that's true, or maybe it's just what you say when you don't have better options. Because here's the thing nobody wants to admit out loud. India's economy has grown despite trade disruptions, not because it solved them. It survived Trump's first trade war by pivoting, adjusting, absorbing the hits. But you can only pivot so many times before you run out of room. And the question nobody in New Delhi wants to answer is this: what happens if the tariffs don't go away? What happens if this is just how trade works now? India can't out-manufacture China. It can't out-negotiate the US. It can't print dollars or rewrite global rules. So what does it do? That's the question that keeps trade advisors awake at night. And right now, nobody has a good answer. Trump's tariffs didn't destroy India's economy, but they revealed something uncomfortable. In a world where trade is a weapon, India is still figuring out how to fight back, and the clock is ticking.